The night was bitterly cold, and the streets were eerily quiet. Jim, a homeless man, sat curled up in a tattered blanket in a deserted alleyway. His fingers were numb, his stomach empty, and his heart heavy with loneliness. In his trembling hands, he held a half-eaten sandwich, a rare meal gifted to him by a kind stranger earlier that evening. As he was about to take a bite, he noticed movement in the shadows. A stray dog, thin and covered in dirt, cautiously stepped forward. Its eyes, filled with hunger and sadness, locked onto Jim's sandwich. Jim sighed. He knew the feeling of starvation all too well. "Here, buddy," he whispered, breaking his sandwich in half and tossing a piece toward the dog. The dog hesitated for a moment before devouring the food in a single gulp. Then, to Jim's surprise, instead of running away, the dog wagged its tail and took a few tentative steps closer. That moment changed everything. From that night on, the dog, whom Jim named Shadow, never left his side. Shadow followed Jim wherever he went, curling up beside him on cold nights and standing guard whenever he slept. The two formed an unbreakable bond. But Shadow wasn't just any stray dog. There was something unusual about him, something that would soon unravel a mystery bigger than Jim could have ever imagined. One evening, as Jim and Shadow were settling down in their usual spot near an abandoned building, Shadow suddenly perked up. His ears twitched, and he let out a low growl before bolting into the darkness. "Shadow, wait!" Jim called, scrambling to his feet and chasing after him. Shadow ran with determination, weaving through alleys and across empty streets. Finally, he stopped in front of an old, rusted gate leading to an abandoned mansion at the edge of the city. The place was eerie, its windows shattered, its walls covered in ivy. The mansion had been deserted for years, yet Shadow scratched at the gate frantically, whining as it tried and get inside. Jim hesitated, but then pushed the gate open. The hinges screeched, breaking the silence of night. Shadow darted ahead, leading Jim inside. The air was thick with dust, and old furniture lay covered in white sheets. As they moved through the grand hallway, Shadow suddenly stopped in front of a door and barked loudly. Jim reached for the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room was untouched, except for one strange detail. On the floor, covered in dust, lay a stack of old newspapers. Jim picked one up, brushing off the grime. His breath caught in his throat as he read the headline. "Missing heir disappears without a trace. Family still searching." Next to the newspapers was something even stranger, a small, tattered blanket. Jim's heart pounded. It was the same blanket Shadow had been sleeping on ever since they met. Before he could process what was happening, the floor creaked behind him. Jim spun around to see a frail, elderly man standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with shock. You found him," the man whispered, his voice trembling. Jim was confused. "Found who?" Tears welled in the old man's eyes as he stepped closer, looking at Shadow with disbelief. "My grandson's dog," he said, his voice breaking. "Shadow belonged to my grandson before he was taken." The man, Mr. Whitmore, explained everything. Years ago, his grandson, Ethan, had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The police had searched for months, but there was no trace of the boy. The case had gone cold, and the family was left with nothing but sorrow. The only thing Ethan had loved more than anything was his dog, Shadow. But on the night Ethan disappeared, Shadow had run away, lost and alone. Yet somehow, after all these years, Shadow had found his way back. Shadow whined softly, then suddenly bolted past the old man, running up a flight of stairs. Jim and Mr. Whitmore exchanged a glance before following him. At the end of the hall, Shadow pawed at a door. Jim pushed it open, and what they saw made their blood run cold. Inside the hidden room, amidst dust-covered furniture, was a small, locked chest. Shadow barked furiously at it. With shaking hands, Mr. Whitmore rushed forward, unlocking the chest with a key that had hung around his neck for years. The lid creaked open, revealing a bundle of old letters, photographs in a single silver locket. Mr. Whitmore gasped. He picked up the locket and opened it. Inside was a picture of his grandson, Ethan, smiling with Shadow as a puppy. Tears streamed down his face. "This means—" "Ethan was here," he choked out. All this time, he was here. With renewed determination, Mr. Whitmore called the authorities. Within hours, police and investigators arrived, reopening the cold case. They discovered hidden documents that led them to a shocking truth. Ethan had been taken by someone close to the family, someone who had kept him locked away for years. But thanks to Shadow and Jim, the truth had finally come to light. Days later, a miracle happened. Ethan, now older but very much alive, was found in a secluded location. He was weak but safe. His first words upon seeing Shadow were a whisper filled with years of longing. "You found me, boy." Tears filled everyone's eyes as Shadow leaped into Ethan's arms, wagging his tail furiously. Mr. Whitmore, overwhelmed with gratitude,